Hello, everybody. I'm Sarah Sadian. I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. And this is our National House Campaign call. Our National House Campaign focuses on advancing anti-racist policies and reforms and achieving the large-scale investments that are needed to ensure that people with the lowest incomes have an affordable place to call home. And we launched this campaign because we recognized that more than ever, we needed bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized need a stable, affordable home. So we're going to get started in just a moment, but just as a reminder of who's on the call with us today, we have advocates from across the country, including homeless shelter and service providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including low-income individuals who might be receiving or in need of federal assistance, people experiencing homelessness, philanthropy, and others. And we really appreciate you joining today because we're going to give a deep dive on the recent election and what it means for our work in promoting housing justice. So some election results are still outstanding, but it's really clear that former President Donald Trump is going to be president again and the 47th president. And based on his track record, there's a lot for impacted people and housing advocates and federal policymakers to be worried about because it poses serious challenges to our ability to enact meaningful solutions to the housing crisis. And I do want to be clear to everyone who's on the call, just like we did with the last administration, the last time President Trump was in office, our coalition mobilized our partners and members across the country. And we worked really closely with our congressional champions to oppose any cruel or harmful proposal that would have undermined housing justice, exacerbated racial and social inequities, and worsened the housing crisis. And we were very successful in defeating those proposals last time around, and we are prepared to do the same now. Of course, we'll always, as we always do, we'll look for opportunities of agreement to move things forward. But we expect that over the next couple of years, a lot of our work is going to be on the defensive side of protecting low-income people and the housing that they live in. So between now and January 20th, we're going to use our National House Campaign calls to prepare ourselves for what's ahead by reviewing where we've been and lessons that we've learned along the way. So today we're going to share our analysis of the election, give an overview of what President Trump did in his first term and what we are expecting ahead. And then we'll talk a little bit more about ways you can take action and ways we can also continue to move the ball forward on racial and social equity while also fighting those fights that are more defensive. So the only other thing I'll just mention before we get started is that all of you on today's call, we know how to do this. We know how to mobilize and push back because all of us are creative. We have the know-how, we have the technical expertise, we have the passion and commitment. We can do it again. But more than that, more than just being advocates, all of us on this call are a part of a community, and we need to rely on each other over the next couple of years because it's going to be really challenging, really dispiriting at times, but we need to rely on one another to carry through. So before we jump into the program, I just want to remind folks you can ask questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as possible. And then we will also share a copy of the PowerPoint presentation and any of our other materials with that people mention. We'll share that with you in the coming days. So I'm going to get started. First, very clearly, President Trump won the Electoral College, but also the popular vote, and many Republicans see it as a clear mandate for them to move forward with their priorities. Next slide. And so when we're trying to understand what it is that President Trump might pursue in the second term, we have a couple of places to look. First, we look at what he said during the presidential campaign. And it was clear that while housing was a very top priority for voters, President Trump tended to focus just on housing supply and to that extent, mostly focused on his proposal to deport undocumented people, claiming that that would open up housing supply for the rest of the public. The other priorities he talked about on the campaign trail got very little coverage. He spent very little time on it, but he did mention wanting to extend opportunity zones, to reduce regulations on housing developers, and to open up federal land for development. Next slide. But we get a much clearer view of what President Trump might push for by looking at his first term and what he was able to achieve. And you can see here that for the most part, President Trump was unable to achieve many of the harmful and cruel measures that he proposed. And he was unable to do so because NLHC and our partners and our champions in Congress and others came together to work in coalition and to fight back, or because he wasn't able to get it through on his own end administratively. So we're going to talk a little bit about these in more details, but I think it's really important to know that we have a success record in pushing back on harmful policies. Next slide. We also can look to Project 2025 to see how that might line up with a future presidential term from Trump. Next slide. I mean, the slide before, if you could go back to that. Thank you. So all of these are things, most of these are things that the President Trump actually did or tried to do in his first term. But what's new here is this focus on replacing career staff with political appointees. And that's really important for our work because many people who were at HUD the last time around try to influence policy, try to mitigate it, try to make it better, and prevent harmful things from happening. And this time around, it's very clear that President Trump is going to try to remove those career staff and to put in place political appointees who will go along with his agenda. Next slide. There are some really important differences between 2024 and 2016. So I'll just point out a couple of these. One, the Trump administration is coming in with the knowledge of how government works. Last time, it took a year and a half or so for them to figure out how to work the wheels of government. Now they know how to navigate government. They know how to implement changes. So we're expecting President Trump to come out with proposals much more quickly than last time around. There's also fewer establishment Republicans who might be willing to serve in the administration or to push back in Congress. President Trump has really remade the Republican Party in his image. And so there are going to be fewer places where we can find champions within the Republican Party to push back. And then finally, there's been a real significant shift in public opinion, which was reinforced by the Supreme Court decision this summer in Grants Pass v. Johnson to allow cities to arrest and ticket and fine unhoused people. So I expect to see more public support for some harmful anti-homelessness provision policies that he might pursue. Next slide. So let's go over the Senate and the House. Republicans have picked up 4 seats. They're now in the majority. Next slide. And there's a question about who's going to become the new leader of the Senate Republicans. Mitch McConnell is stepping down. There are a couple of options that are available. Rick Scott is really considered to be maybe a Trump favorite. So we're going to see, again, that play out between more establishment Republicans and more Trump Republicans. Next slide. We're going to see major changes on the banking committee. So Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina is going to become the chair, the lead Republican on the committee. And then on the Democratic side, we suffered a major loss with Sherrod Brown from Ohio losing his seat. He had led the banking committee for Democrats in a really important way with a lot of integrity and with a lot of alignment with NLHC in terms of who we need to focus on and prioritize. A really big loss, obviously. But we're looking ahead to see who might take up that mantle. And we think actually that next in line would most likely be Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for us. Next slide. So just a word on who Tim Scott is, maybe get some insight into what his priorities might be as chair. He has introduced some housing legislation. A lot of it's focused on increasing access to credit, or reforming regulatory issues. His Road to Housing Act has some good provisions in it, but also some provisions that NLHC opposes. And there was one bill, the co-alerts bill, that we've actually endorsed that would have called for smoke detectors in all HUD housing. Next slide. So pretty moderate, I'd say overall, pretty reasonable approach generally. And then Elizabeth Warren, we think she might be the next in line to lead Democrats on the committee. You can see here, many of the bills that she introduced are very aligned with NLHC. In fact, we've endorsed many of them. I'll just call out the top two bills that are there, which are really focused on building more housing supply, especially for the lowest income households. The first bill that's mentioned prioritizes funding for the Housing Trust Fund. The second bill prioritizes funding for public housing. So it's good to see that if she does become the ranking member, she's very aligned with what our goals are. Next slide. Likewise, we're going to see some changes on the Appropriations Committee, but nothing quite as drastic as on the Banking Committee. Susan Collins will take over as the full chair of the committee, and Cindy Hyde-Smith will become the chair for the transportation and HUD programs. But mostly the makeup of those subcommittees stay the same. So a lot of continuity there going forward. Next slide. The Finance Committee got a bit of a wipeout. You can see here, a lot of Democrats on that committee lost their seats or retired. And so there's going to be a need to shore up that committee as well with new Democrats on board. So major changes we see on that side. Next slide. On the House, folks are predicting that Republicans will win a slim majority in the House. There are some races that are still outstanding in California. I don't know why it takes them so long to count up their ballots, but it does. People are predicting maybe it'll end up where Republicans have 219 or 220 votes in the House, which gives them a razor thin margin, but still a majority. Next slide. We can skip that slide. Continuity and leadership. There is going to be a big change on the House Financial Services Committee. So this is the committee that oversees housing policy. Patrick McHenry retired this year. He stepped down as chair. And there is a conversation among Republicans about who might replace him. And I have listed those folks there. Each of them come to the table with a different focus on housing and different set of priorities. I think if we see somebody like French Hill, we might see an opportunity to make tweaks to housing programs to further improve them. And so we'll just keep a close eye to see what direction that goes. The only other change I wanted to mention is that there are other folks on committee who either lost their seat or retired, moved on, and one of them was Representative Lukemeyer, who has a long history of being focused on housing programs in that committee, and sort of one of the last remaining Republicans who really prioritize housing as a on that committee. Next slide. Appropriations Committee, not many changes at all. Representative Tom Cole from Oklahoma will become the full committee chairman, and bringing with him a lot of focus on tribal housing needs, which we have seen play out in other appropriations bills, but otherwise very status quo for the Appropriations Committee. Next slide. And likewise, a lot of continuity on the Ways and Means Committee, which is the committee that oversees tax policy. Next slide. So we've been able to gather a few things about what President Trump wants to prioritize in office. You'll see here a list of those priorities. Not many of them apply to housing, but I still wanted to share this with all of you so you could see sort of what's on the table for them. Of course, you know, they've said over and over again that deporting undocumented immigrants is going to be a day one action. It's something we're paying very close attention to. But you'll also see that there's a focus on rolling back policies that were put in place by President Biden to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion, LGBTQ rights, and civil rights, which will have an impact on the work that we do. Next slide. Congress also has set its agenda for the year, or is in the process of creating that. We fully expect a lot of the focus next year will be on extending the 2017 tax bill that Republicans passed when they were in office before, that gave tax cuts to corporations and the wealthy, rolling back environmental investments from the Inflation Reduction Act. And probably most important for us is they'll have to lift the debt ceiling next year. And what we've seen in the past is Republicans often use that as an opportunity to negotiate for spending caps that are put in place on domestic programs, including housing programs. And we're going to have to be very attuned to that and push back on proposals that would gut housing programs. Next slide. Just to say, I wanted to close out a little bit. We have a lot of new members of Congress. There's a lot of changes each time there's an election. We have 11 new senators. If one of these folks are your senators, you should start building relationships with them now, whether they're Republican or Democrat. Have that reoccurring engagement with them because it's going to be incredibly important that we have a connection to these folks and can talk with them about our priorities for next year. Next slide. Same on the House side. This is not even all of our new representatives. There's a lot of them. We have at least 63 new representatives and many more who might come in because there's still those outstanding races. But don't wait until next year to start building those relationships. You can do that now. Next slide. And with that, that's sort of the broad overview. I'm going to turn it over to Kim, who's going to share a little bit more about what we expect from a legislative point of view, a policy point of view, both in the lame duck and next year.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and hi, everyone. I'm Kim Johnson, the policy manager here at NLIHC. I'm happy to be with you all today, even if a lot of this news is a bit grim. So to define a couple terms first, the lame duck session refers to the period between the end of the election and the beginning of the new Congress. So that is between now and December 20th is when Congress is supposed to go out for the year. So between now and then, the Biden administration and Congress are going to need to fulfill a few priorities. The two that we are going to be paying the most attention to are passing a final spending bill or another continuing resolution by that deadline of December 20th, and enacting a disaster recovery funding bill. There remains a lot of work to be done on both. The House draft HUD funding bill provided a 3% cut to HUD funding from the previous year, while the Senate's provided a 10% increase to HUD funding. So they still need to reach an agreement on top line funding for the various federal programs that are funded through these appropriations bills. To dive a little bit more into the details of what we're expecting, before the election, most people were speculating that we would be looking at a disaster recovery bill with a continuing resolution that was attached to it lasting until February or March. And that's because historically, House Speaker Mike Johnson has opposed an omnibus spending bill, which refers to taking all 12 appropriations bills and putting it into one gigantic funding bill, as opposed to passing each one individually or putting them into smaller packages and passing them that way. However, now that a disaster recovery package is on the table, Congress simply does not have the floor time remaining to pass all 12 appropriations bills through regular order. So there is some speculation that Republicans are going to want a clean slate for the incoming administration and Congress, which would be motivation to finish their work on FY25 before the new Congress begins. Republican leaders are consulting with the incoming administration on their strategy moving forward. But for us and in our work, we are going to continue to push Congress to finalize that FY25 spending bill with increased funding for HUD, affordable housing, and homelessness assistance programs. And I believe my colleague Elena is dropping a link in the chat right now for folks to take action on that. And then with the disaster recovery funding bill, now that Congress is back in session, they're going to begin putting together the outlines of what this bill is going to look like. Over the election recess, Speaker Mike Johnson estimated that this recovery funding bill was going to cover between $50 and $100 billion for communities that have been impacted by hurricanes Helene and Milton, as well as, of course, continued disaster recovery efforts after the fires in Maui and funding for other disaster impacted areas as well. We're also using this as an opportunity to potentially advance the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, which is a priority for NLHC and our Disaster Housing Recovery Coalition. I believe my colleague Elena is again dropping a link in the chat for more information about the Reforming Disaster Recovery Act, but a very quick top line summary of it is that this bill would permanently authorize something called the Community Disaster Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBGDR program, which helps ensure that funding gets to the lowest income and most impacted communities and people in order to ensure a more equitable disaster recovery system and process for everyone. So thank you, Elena, for dropping those links in the chat. And if you are part of an organization and haven't joined on to either our FY25 appropriations bill or the Disaster Housing or Reforming Disaster Recovery Act sign-on letter, please consider doing so. And thank you to everyone who has joined on to either or both of those so far. So looking ahead to the Trump administration and reflecting back on what the last administration looked like, we're trying to kind of put together what to expect in the coming year. So in the past, the Trump administration has proposed deep cuts to HUD funding ranging from between 15 and 18% to HUD programs. Those Trump administration proposed budgets have also called for eliminating housing vouchers for between 160,000 and 250,000 households through deep budget cuts. It's proposed zeroing out funding for the construction of housing, including public housing and the National Housing Trust Fund, and eliminating the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which helps coordinate homelessness responses between government agencies. These proposals were rejected by Congress, but they did, of course, lead to that historic 35-day government shutdown in, I believe, was it 2017? And it's important, too, to note that regardless of who controls the White House, it is Congress who ultimately has spending authority. And so it's Congress who has to reach a bicameral and typically bipartisan agreement on federal spending. And up next, I want to pass it on over to Sarah to talk a little bit about tax policy and what we saw during the 2017 Trump administration and the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Thanks for that, Kim. Yeah, so in 2017, tax was again a top priority for Republicans in Congress, and they passed a bill that provided really deep tax cuts for the wealthy and for corporations. In terms of housing, I think one of the most important things to note was that the low-income housing tax credit and the reforms that we're pushing for weren't included in that tax bill, even though there has been historically really broad bipartisan support for the program. So it's something that we're keeping in mind going forward. I think what's really important for folks to know about here on the tax side is that because Republicans are poised to have control of the House and the Senate, they're going to use a process called budget reconciliation to allow them to pass a tax package with only 50 votes in the Senate rather than the typical 60 votes that you normally would see, for example, with an appropriations bill. So that really means that they can bypass Democrats next year. They have very slim margins in their majority, so they'll have to work hard to keep everyone together. But there's going to be very little opportunity for Democrats to influence that bill next year. Next slide. I also wanted to say a little bit about what President Trump did and said on housing supply when he was president the first time. It's sort of a double-edged sword here. On the one hand, he did sign an executive order focusing on ways to eliminate barriers to housing development, ways to streamline and encourage more housing supply to be built. But we also saw President Trump talk about housing supply in a way that re-entrench racial animus. He talked about protecting suburban communities from low-income housing that might be built in that area. He, really threatened this in the very racist and classist way of threatening communities that he was going to protect them from low-income housing from being built. This time around, he's talked about those housing development barriers and wanting to cut them back. Also talked about opening up federal land for development. Both of those are important and good things that LIHC could possibly, support them on, but we'll have to pay very close attention to see what those particular rules are and whether or not he's using that as a way to exacerbate racial segregation. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back to my colleague, Kim, to talk about homelessness.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So to keep this conversation going, during his first administration, under President Trump's former administration, sorry, just thinking about things, the president and his administration undermined a lot of proven solutions to homelessness. So replacing the head of the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness with a man named Robert Marbut, who advocates for what he calls housing fourth, which indicates the way in which he thinks about homelessness as something that is a personal fault of the people experiencing it, as opposed to the result of systemic discrimination and other factors. The Trump administration also proposed to shift HUD funding away from housing first in homelessness programs and towards things that mandate treatment or programs in which someone has to, quote unquote, earn the right to sleep inside or sleep in a bed. The Trump administration proposed to allow shelters to discriminate against transgender people who are experiencing homelessness, not allowing them into a shelter that aligns with their gender identity. And the administration has proposed camps for unhoused people where, again, they would, quote unquote, earn the right to sleep indoors and in a bed by performing tasks around the camp and fulfilling other kind of menial responsibilities. The president also has broad authority to shift the focus within homelessness funding unless Congress moves to stop them. And like Sarah said at the top of her presentation, given the Supreme Court's ruling in Grants Pass versus Johnson, all of this bodes kind of poorly for the forecast on federal action around homelessness and housing first. Around immigration, of course, no surprises. The Trump administration has moved to evict mixed status immigrant households and discourage access to housing benefits for immigrants. During the previous administration, they released HUD's mixed status immigrant household notice of proposed rulemaking, which would essentially say that mixed immigrant status households who receive HUD assistance would either need to kick their undocumented family member out of the house or lose access to their housing. To be clear, households that are mixed immigrant status currently receive funding on a prorated basis. So if somebody in the household is undocumented, they do not receive funding for that one family member. Basically, it's like a little carve out. Instead of being counted as a family of 4, they're counted as a family of 3. And what this rule would have done is say, either you need to get that one person out or you all need to move and lose your housing assistance. So that notice of proposed rulemaking came out, but we rallied with our colleagues and other advocates against the changes to that or against that proposed rule ended up getting thousands and thousands of statements that ended up really gumming up the works for that mixed status rule, and it ultimately was not implemented. The Trump administration did manage to publish a final public charge rule that, that would really harm immigrant families by basically saying receiving housing assistance counts towards a public charge uh, qualification in immigration decisions. And of course, Trump has called for the mass deportation of undocumented people. And I think that really says enough for what the Trump administration plans to do around immigration policy. For tenants' rights, the Trump administration has also proposed to increase rent on HUD's households, including tripling the minimum rent for working households and increasing the minimum rent for disabled families and the elderly. They've proposed allowing HUD to change rent policies without protections for renters and proposing work requirements. And one, housing is a human right, of course. And most people who are already living in HUD housing are, of course, already working. We know that the issue is not a lack of will or willingness, but rather a lack of affordable housing for people who are paid the lowest wages. It is important to note too that a lot of policy changes require congressional action, although there are federal agencies that have the authority to take action around tenants' rights. We've seen that used for the better under the current administration with things like oh my gosh, sorry. I totally had a brain freeze. With things like the FHFA's proposed rules around tenant rights, and the FTC's proposed rules around limiting junk fees in tenant applications. For fair housing, the Trump administration also suspended and replaced the affirmatively furthering fair housing rule. They have undermined the disparate impact rule, which is another way of determining whether or not a policy has a disparate impact on a protected group. And the Trump administration failed repeatedly to bring major enforcement actions or investigations of fair housing violations. The administration has a lot of authority to influence fair housing. Congress also, of course, has a lot of authority to pass fair housing laws, but they have shown much less interest in doing so. So with all that being said, I'm going to turn it back on over to Sarah to introduce our next speaker.
And actually, before we do that, Kim, there are a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Maybe we could go over those first.
Let's do it.
One, Vicky is asking, what do we know about funding levels for, in this case, COCs, but I think maybe you could speak more broadly to what are the threats ahead about funding levels for HUD programs?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vicky. So like I said at the top, historically, the Trump administration has proposed really steep cuts to HUD's budget, and that includes, unfortunately, HUD's homelessness assistance programs, which also, of course, covers the COC and ESG programs. So looking ahead, I think that even though we're seeing increased numbers of people experiencing homelessness, of families struggling to make ends meet and to pay the cost of rent, we are also going to see some proposed cuts to HUD's budget around ESG and COC funding. It is going to be up to us to continue to make the case to members of Congress for the necessity of increased funding every year for these vital programs, and especially given the hardships that we know that people are experiencing on the ground. So unfortunately, it does not bode well, but we are going to continue to be here to fight for funding increases.
I'll just build on that a little bit to say, in all of the examples that Kim went over, which thank you, Kim, was very in depth, in all but one, advocates, all of us here, were successful in defeating them. And that includes the budget fights that we had. And that's because in Congress, you need 60 votes in the Senate to pass a spending bill. And Republicans don't have 60 votes in the Senate. So that necessitates there's a role for Democrats to play and holding the line and preventing cuts from going forward. So next year, we're going to really have to lean into our relationships with both Democrats and moderate Republicans, to Kim's point, to make the case for housing investments and to push back on these harmful cuts. And one thing that I think we have in our favor that we didn't have in 2016 is that very clearly renters have said housing is an issue. Like, voters in this election made it very clear they are struggling to afford housing, and this is not the time to cut investments. In fact, this is the time that we should be strengthening and expanding those programs. And then I'll ask you one more question, Kim, if I can. Melody's asking, can you share any of the logic behind why the Trump administration proposed increasing rent on HUD households?
Yeah, so that is again a great question. Unfortunately, the logic doesn't hold. Increasing rent on households with the lowest incomes is, what's the saying about you can't squeeze blood from a stone? I think really more than anything, increasing rent is just an attempt to push more people out of HUD housing, and to make it untenable, for them to continue living there. It's really, to me, not based in logic as much as it is in cruelty and the idea, I guess, that some people are somehow cheating the system and sitting on money that they can spend on rent and choosing not to, but we know that that is not true. So, looking for kind of like the logic in it, it's based in misconceptions and stereotypes about who these HUD households are, more than anything that's actually legitimately logical or makes sense.
Yeah, great point, Kim. I'd also say that it totally misunderstands the reason why people struggle to pay rent and why they need HUD investments. And it's because people are working, they're just working jobs that pay really low wages that aren't keeping up with housing costs. And so, I think sometimes President Trump and then Secretary Ben Carson had this idea that if we force people to pay more, somehow they're going to magically find how jobs that pay them higher wages. But the reality is that 42% of the workforce isn't paid median wages that is enough to afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So there we go. Now we can turn it. Thank you, Kim, so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. We're so lucky to have you on board at the coalition. I'm going to turn it over to Brooke, who can share a little bit more about how you can take action today and how you can take action with us next year. Thanks, Brooke.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks, Kim, for that overview of what we can expect in the upcoming Trump administration and the new Congress. If you could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And good afternoon, everyone. Like Sarah said, my name is Brooke Shipwright, and I'm the Director of Field Organizing here at NLHC. So as you just heard, there's no question that we face serious challenges ahead to advancing meaningful, affordable housing and homelessness solutions, and actually face a lot of threats. But we also know that together, our members and partners across the country, alongside our champions in Congress, that we can and will defeat harmful policies put forward. And as always, we'll look for potential areas of agreement. As Sarah and Kim shared, we were successful in defeating or delaying multiple proposals that would have significantly worsened our country's housing and homelessness crisis. And we even won $25 billion for emergency rental assistance during the pandemic and a national eviction moratorium to keep families stably housed. And now we're an even stronger coalition than we were then. So let's go ahead and talk about a few ways that you can take action and start preparing now and get plugged into our work for the work we have ahead. So NLHC's Advocacy Hub is a one-stop shop for exactly this. First, on this page, if you follow the QR code or the URL below, or if you're on your phone, you can go to nlhc.org/take-action. First on that page, you'll find our latest actions that you can take for each policy priority issue area. And contact your members of Congress. So for example, we have our federal budget policy priority or appropriations like Kim talked about. And we have two different actions listed there. One, to contact your members of Congress to oppose cuts and instead fund to the highest level possible housing and homelessness solutions. And then also adding your organization to a sign-on letter with these same asks. So we have a lot of different actions, both for individuals and organizations, and encourage you to check that out. All you do is click on a policy priority to learn more and see which actions are available for you to take. And each action includes talking points that we update regularly, as this is an ever-changing environment. We want you to have the latest and greatest talking points, and you can use these when weighing in with your members of Congress. One thing to keep in mind, though, as we're entering this next phase of our advocacy, is that effective advocacy is not just one action and, check mark, you're done. It's keeping that drum beating on the issues that we care about to keep it top of mind for your elected officials. So even if you've already taken action on an issue, keep doing so and personalize your message each time to your members of Congress so that like I said, that issue stays front of mind for them. Next on the Advocacy Hub, we also have a learning lab, which you'll find resources for both new and seasoned advocates alike. For example, we have Advocacy 101 webinar recordings, a meeting request template to request meetings with your elected officials, tips for effective meetings with them, and helpful data points from your state from NLHC's research. And we'll continue building out this page, and we'll continue including updated advocacy toolkits as they become available. Next slide. So still on the Advocacy Hub, under the far right tab, we have Get Connected, which offers a variety of ways for you to get involved in our work and stay up to date with our efforts. So if you remember nothing else from me today, please remember this: the NLHC field team member for your state, which we have this map here, kind of hard to see depending on your screen size. But I will also include the link in the chat shortly when I'm done talking, because I'm not great at multitasking. But like I said, if you remember nothing else, please remember your field team member, that you can reach out to them. They can serve as your point of contact and a resource to you for all of NLHC's federal advocacy work, and connect you with others in our network so that we continue to strengthen our movement. We know that you're all very busy and don't have time to keep up to date with all of the federal happenings and read through all of our reports and resources. So simply reach out to your field team member and we can get you connected with whatever it is you're looking for and get you the support that you need to be effective. And then finally, under that tab, you'll also find links to sign up for NLHC's emails, including our calls to action on policy developments, links to recurring webinars and working groups such as this webinar, and can learn more about the various projects and campaigns led by NLHC. Next slide. Thank you. And lastly, much of our work at NLHC is made possible by our individual and organizational members. And so first, I thank those of you who are current NLHC members, and I invite those of you who aren't current members to join today. Here's a QR code on your screen that will take you to our membership page. You can join easily online at that page. And if you're joining by phone, you can go to nlhc.org/membership. Membership dues are annual suggested amounts, meaning you can join at any amount that works for you. And NLHC members receive special benefits, such as discounted tickets to our annual housing policy forum in DC, which we just launched the registration for, exclusive access to quarterly members only policy advisory committee meetings, prioritized support from NLHC staff, and more. If you have questions about becoming a member or want to check your membership status, please reach out to your field team member and we'll happily look that up. And with that, I will turn it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Brooke. I appreciate it. One of the things I think we're trying to get across here is we need our partners in the field to be ready to take action next year, right? We are stronger than ever before, but so are the threats that are ahead. And so if you aren't already a member, if you're on this call, we really need to bring together the whole field to be prepared to respond to these threats. So if you aren't a member, please join. If you know people who might be interested, have them join our listserv so that when there are times where you need to take action, you'll know about them and you can engage. So I appreciate the update, Brooke, on how folks can get engaged. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sid and Gabby from our ideas team at NLHC. I want to make sure folks know we talked a lot about the threats that are ahead, and we have to do a lot of that defensive work. But we also have to keep our eye on our long-term goal of advancing housing justice, advancing racial and social equity. And so I'm going to turn it over to Sid and Gabby to talk about how we're continuing to build that power and build that work that we do.
Cool. Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you, Brooke, for sharing the Advocacy Hub. It looks really good. And hi, everyone. Thank you for having me on today. My name is Gabby Ross, and I'm a project manager for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the National Low Income Housing Coalition. On the IDEAS team. IDEAS stands for Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, Anti-Racism, and Systems Thinking. Over the past few years, NLIHC has strengthened our racial equity and inclusion work. And this past year, the organization has been more intentional about what that means for our work and what fundamental changes are needed to ensure the work is prioritized and sustainable. NLIHC is committed to advancing racial equity and striving for racial justice through our policy and research priorities, our advocacy strategies, and how we organize for solutions on the federal level. As an organization, we recognize that historically and presently, policies and practices that promote discrimination and exclusion have been used as mechanisms to codify racial inequity in housing. And these racist and neglectful policies are deep-rooted in the country's housing system. And we are working to correct and heal from the harm caused and the harm that continues to happen, especially as we just discussed on today's call, all of the potential harms to the housing policies that protect people experiencing homelessness and low-income renters as well. So this undertaking not only impacts our external efforts, as just mentioned, but also how we approach our work and workplace internally. This requires the organization to critically examine how we operate and identify the ways we reinforce practices that continue to uphold white supremacy within the organization, how we collaborate with our greater network, especially with tenants and people with lived and living experience. This also requires honest conversation and analysis of how we've engaged tenants in the past and what we need to do better to ensure that we're truly being inclusive and uplifting tenants and centering their voices and needs in our mission. This work comes with recognizing that inclusion and equity do not happen in a vacuum. Our mission strives to achieve both of those, but to do that effectively with our network and partners, it is important that staff are also able to experience a workplace that champions those same values. This work has come with developing new ways for staff to have a say in their workplace, voicing how systems and processes in place impact their work, and how they support our overall goal of racial justice. This iteration of the work stems from an organization-wide survey the staff participated in last year that showed how the organization has been faring in regards to culture and equity. The findings of the survey have been a launching point for a new phase, this new phase of NLIHC's racial equity and inclusion work, and it creates an environment where staff have a stake in their workplace, aiming to foster a culture of belonging and community. From HC has established an internal working group that focuses on addressing the concerns raised in this survey, and this group is composed of staff from different teams and different levels of seniority in the organization. And it is an effort led by me and the Director of People and Culture here at NLIHC. These findings have also helped to frame what staff need as far as trainings, professional development opportunities that aid them in their own personal and professional journey of striving for racial justice, equity, and inclusion. One example of this is a recent training NLIHC staff participated in that focuses on authentic engagement with people with lived experience. This training was provided by the Anti-Racism Center for Justice and Transformative Change, also known as ARC for Justice, and I'll drop a link to them in the chat shortly. And this training was important for all staff to participate in as we are taking a holistic approach to tenant engagement and collaborating with tenant organizations and leaders who have been directly impacted by harmful housing policy and making sure that we strengthen our work with tenants and that we are not being extractive and also pouring back into the tenants and communities that we work with. And now I will pass it to Sid Betancourt to discuss our commitment to tenant engagement and advocacy. And thank you again for having me on. Please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, or if you would just like to chat, and I'll drop my email in the chat box, and I'll pass it to Sid. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. And hello, everyone. Again, thank you to my colleagues for inviting us here to talk today about some of the work we're doing around racial equity and tenant leadership. My name is Sid Betancourt, and as it says on the screen, I'm a project manager for inclusive community engagement, and I also use she, they pronouns. And I hope everyone's taking care of themselves and their communities as well. And I know Gabby talked a lot about like the internal work that we're doing, but I do want to just briefly talk about some of the external work that we've been doing to like empower tenant leadership and some of the work that we're hoping to also do in the future. And I hope it's helpful for everyone. There's still a lot of work to be done, as we heard earlier today, and I want you all to know that you all play an essential role in that. And we have like a lot of people power here, so we really want to make sure that you're aware of some of the things that you can be involved in, to not just be reactive to this, but so that we can continue to be proactive and build that people power into the future. But since its inception, NLIHC has always worked really closely with folks who have lived or living experiences with housing injustice, including, having directly impacted people on our board. And in the past few years, maybe decade plus more, we've created programmings, publications, which I will share more about shortly. So that folks can easily access federal housing advocacy. And I'll drop a link in the chat shortly too, just to check out some of the tenant engagement resources that we have, and you can kind of learn more about them and follow along as I talk about them. But I'll begin by highlighting one of our semi-annual newsletters called Tenant Talk, and it's created to engage residents in housing advocacy. It comes out twice a year, as I said, and this year we had 2 come out already. So our spring issue was titled The Resilient Work of Tenants, and it explored the long history and the current state of tenant organizing within the United States, as well as what future prospective efforts might look like. We also had a fall issue called Voting as Collective Action, which, is very, very timely, but it featured articles on why voting matters, and a lot of nonpartisan resources to help ensure there's higher voter turnout among low-income renters. And obviously, voting and election engagement is, as one of my colleagues would say, it's not just an election, like election years are all the time. So even though the election is over, I hope that resource is helpful for you, and I'll drop the link to access those publications in the chat as well. And we also have a monthly webinar or meeting that is called Tenant Talk Live, and it happens the first Monday of every month. And it's really meant to be a space where directly impacted folks can come from across the country to be connected with NLIHC, but mostly to be connected with each other and learn best practices around influencing federal housing policy so they can take that back into their communities. And our next session is actually going to be this Monday, December 2nd, yes, at 6 p.m. Eastern time. And just to give you like some idea of the topics that we've covered recently, we've had folks talk about disaster recovery and what that looks like when you're a tenant and trying to organize your community. We've also had folks come talk about disability justice recently, and sometimes we even have topics that are super niche, like how to ensure that you get your security deposit back. So there's a lot of variety in there, and I definitely welcome folks to join that community. I'll drop the link to register for that in the chat, but also the link to view any past recordings in the chat as well. And then I also want to highlight NLHC's collective program, which is a bit of a newer program. It started about 2 years ago, and it's a dedicated group of tenant and community leaders that have that lived experience with housing and justice, and they work to advance housing and racial justice in their communities. And so far, we've had 3 cohorts. The first inaugural collective was launched in 2022. And a lot of these folks already had experience engaging with NLHC for the most part, but they were able to kind of engage in that federal housing advocacy through writing comment letters, visiting the White House at the time to talk about tenant protections. And then we also had the second collective launch in 2023 through 2024. And they also got to do a lot of that advocacy. And we just accepted our largest collective cohort this year. And you can learn more about them at the link that I'll drop in the chat shortly. But I think it's the largest and most geographically diverse, collective that we've had so far. But if you're interested in learning more about that, you can view the article I just put in the chat, and we open applications for those usually in the late spring and early summer if you're interested in being involved in that. And then I will also touch on our tenant sessions. So for folks who might be newer to our network, every year NLHC hosts an annual policy forum. And in addition to that, we have like a pre-forum event called the tenant session, and it's exclusive to low-income tenants and residents of subsidized housing so that they have that space to connect with one another and learn more about, organizing, but at the national level. And if you would like to join us this year for that, our registration is currently open for that as well. And there's like an option to make sure that you click that. I don't have that link ready, actually. I thought I did, but I'll share it in the chat later as well if nobody else gets it before me. But this year it was really exciting because we did something that we hadn't done before, and we participated, or the participants were able to engage with HUD through town halls and office hours. So they were able to directly ask HUD staff questions about programming and different things, but we were also able to include more sessions around wellness, liberation, as well as some of the challenges that folks were experiencing while organizing. And we also look forward to growing and improving this session in the future so that folks are able to network with other partners outside of just tenant leaders so that they have greater access to the network that is NLHC. And lastly, I'll just touch on some of the work that one of my colleagues is doing. He's on paternity leave right now, but his name is Dee Ross, and he's our tenant leader fellow. But he is doing really great work in building relationships and building like a very big and comprehensive network of tenant unions and just tenant leaders across the country, kind of looking at the strengths that these groups have, what do they need, and just recognizing like what we could do as NLHC to help out these groups, but also just working with them to build those relationships, and also providing like innovative strategies and guidance to tenant movements across the country. And also hopefully working to create a training institute that would create tools, resources to help tenant leaders with like social media advocacy, conflict resolution techniques and stuff like that. So he's doing a lot of innovative and cool work, and we're excited to see where that goes as well. But that's a lot of information, and I hope it's a little bit hopeful because I know we had a lot of stuff to cover today, but I'm always happy to answer any questions if you all have any.
Thanks, Sid. Thanks, Gabby. It's really helpful to hear about all the important work that you're doing so that even though times are difficult, even though we're seeing a lot of defensive work ahead, that folks also know there's a lot of really good opportunities to advance our mission at the same time. I do see that there's one question I'll try to get to really quickly before we jump off the call about NLHC's CEO. You may have heard that Diane Yantel is stepping down after almost 9 years as being our CEO. Our board of directors is put together a search committee. So if you know somebody who might be interested in being CEO, or you think you have an idea of who might be great in that role, let us know. Because as Vicky says, having a strong, consistent leadership is incredibly important, especially in difficult times. And we know that our next CEO is going to build on all of the great success that Diane has helped lead our team on. So with that, we're right at time. I'm going to close out our call. Just a reminder, we'll share our PowerPoint with folks and other links and materials and a follow-up email that goes out on Friday. And we look forward, even though it's challenging, to working with you to push back against harmful policies and to push forward good ones. So it's great to be in community with you all. Have a good day. Talk to you guys soon.